In 2009, the popular true crime TV show Cops just happened to be in South Florida filming when a truly diabolical crime was committed there. And so cops captured this crime on camera. But someone in their footage was hiding something. And when you know what that something was, it becomes very obvious when you watch. But before we get into today's story, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right place because that's all we do, and we upload once or twice every week. So if that's of interest to you, please ask the like button if you can borrow their car for the week, and then when they say yes, spend that week driving around picking up as much roadkill as possible and packing it into their trunk. Picking up as much roadkill as you possibly can and pack it into their backseat in their trunk and then return the car. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. All right, let's get into today's story. Michael DiPolito grew up in a very rough neighborhood in South Philadelphia where violence, drugs, and prostitution were just normal parts of everyday life. At a young age, like his parents, Michael became an alcoholic. He also developed a very serious drug addiction that he paid for by selling drugs. Michael would eventually drop out of high school, and not long after that, he became homeless and was living out on the streets, sleeping in abandoned buildings at night to stay warm. In 1993, when Michael was still in South Philadelphia, he was arrested for the first time. He was charged with possession of an unknown drug as well as intent to distribute this unknown drug. Court records don't specify what drug this was. However, Michael just did not show up for court, and so a warrant was put out for his arrest. Michael would somehow manage to evade police capture, and by 1997, he had fled South Philly altogether and landed in South Florida in a town called Boca Raton. Shortly after arriving there, Michael was arrested for a second time, this time for offering an undercover police officer $15 in exchange for sex. Michael would plead guilty to soliciting prostitution, however, he would just get released. A year after the prostitution arrest, Michael was sued by a former girlfriend named Karen Tan, who claimed he was the father of her son, and so he owed her child support, and Karen had a DNA test that backed up this claim. However, Michael, again, would just not show up for court, and before long, Karen just gave up and dropped the lawsuit. Michael was likely very relieved when this happened, because at the time, he was making almost no money through a temp agency. And so after this lawsuit gets dropped, Michael decides, I need to go out and make some real money. And somehow, on his quest to find a more lucrative opportunity, Michael was introduced to associates of the Bonanno family. And the Bonanno family is one of the infamous 5 families that dominates organized crime across the United States. They are literally the Italian mafia. And after the mafia met Michael, they took a liking to him, and they did offer him a more lucrative, albeit illegal, opportunity. They gave him a role inside one of their so-called boiler rooms. A boiler room is not literally a boiler room. Instead, it's a group of fraudsters that use high-pressure sales tactics to steal money from unsuspecting victims. Typically, the way it works is the fraudster will cold call someone, and they will tell them that they have this great get-rich-quick scheme, but you gotta give me your money right now if you want to be a part of it. And so when the victim says, okay, that sounds great, and they wire the money along, the fraudster just steals their money. Michael, who was very charismatic and a natural salesman, got really good at tricking people into giving him their money. And so eventually, Michael realized he could make a lot more money if he started his own boiler room, where his commission could be much higher on the money he stole. And so fairly abruptly, he left the mafia's boiler room. We don't really know how they reacted to this. And Michael would set up not 1, but 2 boiler room scams of his own in South Florida. And by 2002, he had pocketed $155,000 of stolen money. However, he had spent virtually all of it on fancy hotels and cars and phone sex. But the good times would not last for Michael, because in 2002, the police caught on to Michael's boiler room scams and they raided them, and Michael was arrested for a third time, except this time he would go to court, he would stand trial, and he would be sentenced to 2 years in prison, 28 years of probation, and he would be ordered to pay back the $155,000 that he stole. Michael would only serve 7 months of his 2-year jail sentence, but that was more than enough to leave a huge impact on him. Michael hated prison. He hated every second of it. And so during those long sleepless nights that he was laying awake in his cell, he made a promise to himself that when he got out, when he was released, he would never, ever come back. And so in 2003, when he was released, he immediately entered a sobriety program. He also started going to the gym every morning, and he began studying for his GED, which is a high school equivalency test because he didn't get his high school diploma. After he successfully earned his GED a couple of months later, he would also start a legal business. It was a digital marketing firm that was called Mad Money Inc. Over the next several years, Michael would do his very best to stay on the straight and narrow and not get in trouble. And for the most part, he did that. By 2008, Michael was still sober, despite a few setbacks, and he was still very focused on his physical fitness and his health, and his business, Mad Money, was doing quite well, earning him nearly $100,000 a year. But his love life had become a bit messy. Michael had gotten married back in 2007 to his longtime girlfriend named Maria Luongo, who had stood by him when he went to jail. But that year, in 2008, when Michael was 38 years old, he cheated on Maria with a 26-year-old real estate agent named Dalia Mohammed, who he met at a Starbucks. And instead of their affair being a quick fling, as they likely both intended it to be, Michael and Dalia quickly fell in love. And when that happened, Michael went to his wife Maria and he told her, and then he divorced her. Just 3 days after the divorce finalized, Michael and Dalia went to the courthouse and they got married. The newlyweds would move into a brand new condo that Michael had purchased for them in Boynton Beach, which is a beautiful town in South Florida. And for a time, their life was perfect. They knew it was a little outrageous the way they had met each other and how quickly they had fallen for each other, but they didn't care. They got along great and they were excited about the future. But their perfect life would not last long. On the evening of March 12th, 2009, so only about a month after they had gotten married, Michael and Dalia were at home in their condo when they heard a knock on the front door. And so Michael went to the door, he opened it up, and much to his surprise, standing on the other side was his probation officer, and behind him was a whole bunch of police officers. And before Michael could even ask what was going on, the probation officer told Michael that they had received an anonymous call tipping them off that Michael was selling steroids and ecstasy pills and other drugs out of his condo. Michael would tell the probation officer that there was no way that was true. He is not selling any drugs, he's sober, he's not doing that. And so eventually Michael just stepped aside and said, "Please come in, search my condo. I have nothing to hide." And so sure enough, the police, they would go into his condo, they would search it, but they wouldn't find anything and they would leave. And so after the police had gone, Michael and Dalia found themselves just standing in their condo, completely dumbfounded. But instead of trying to get to the bottom of it right then and there about who had called and why, they just decided it was best for them to just leave their condo for the night and go stay at a nice hotel. And so they packed up some bags, they left their condo, which was a total mess from the police search, and they went to the hotel and they had a nice night together. The next morning, when they got up and headed down to the parking lot, they saw up ahead, standing around Michael's car, was Michael's probation officer as well as several other police officers. And so Michael and Dalia are looking at each other like, what is this, again? And so they hustle on over to Michael's car, and before they can even plead their innocence to Michael's probation officer, he stops Michael and just says, "Look, we got another anonymous call, this time telling us that you are selling drugs out of your vehicle, and so we need to search it." And so Michael is just totally beside himself, but he says, "Look, go ahead, search it. There's nothing in the car." And so sure enough, the police would open up his car, they'd rip it apart, but again, they wouldn't find anything. Over the next couple of weeks, the only thing Michael and Dalia ever wanted to talk about was what the heck was going on. Who is placing these anonymous calls claiming that Michael was selling drugs out of the condo and out of the car? It just didn't add up. They wanted to believe that this was all just one big mistake, but in the back of both of their minds, they were thinking about Michael's very checkered past and his previous dealings with the mafia and with people he had clearly ripped off. And so maybe there was someone in his past that was looking to get back at Michael and maybe get him arrested and sent back to jail. Fast forward to March 29th, so 17 days after that first raid on their condo, and that night, Michael and Dahlia had been eating dinner at a restaurant, and when they left and headed out to the parking lot, once again, standing around Michael's car were several police officers clearly waiting for him to return. And so without even needing to ask why they were there, Michael and Dahlia, they go over to them and they just start pleading with them to understand that this is a setup. We do not have drugs in this car. We don't know what's going on here. Please, you gotta understand that someone's doing this to us. But this time, when they searched his car, they would find something. Before we go any further, I want to tell you about today's sponsor, Experian. Back when I was just a young buck in college, I was broke. And so naturally, I took out a credit card with a $5,000 limit and immediately maxed it out on buffalo chicken calzones and beer. Now, as soon as my card got declined, I didn't pay it off. Instead, I just took the card, tucked it back into my wallet, and forgot about it. But the bank did not forget about my $5,000 debt, and my failure to pay it back wrecked my FICO score. A FICO score is a type of credit score. Over the last 10 years, I've been able to rebuild my credit score, but it has been a slow and painful process. And so my suggestion to you is to avoid the unpaid beer and calzone credit trap and just closely monitor your credit score. And with Experian, you can do that for free. In addition to closely monitoring your credit score, they will also send you alerts anytime your credit changes. Experian also offers a dark web scan. If you've ever been the victim of a data breach, and you may not know if you have or not, your information potentially could live in the dark web, and that's a place where criminals could use it to commit fraud, and if that happens, it'll wreck your credit along with a bunch of other horrible things, unless you catch it and report it. And on that, if you do find inaccuracies on your credit report, you can easily submit disputes and track those disputes on Experian's online dispute center. It is time to take charge of your credit. Get Experian credit monitoring, alerts, your FICO score, and that dark web scan all for free. Just go to Experian.com/MrBallen. Again, that's EXPERIAN.com/MrBallen. Okay, back to the story. After searching Michael's car, the police would find a small bag of cocaine stuck inside of a cigarette carton tucked underneath his spare tire in the trunk. And when Michael saw them pull the cocaine out, he began to cry because he knew, even though it was not his and he had not put it there, that he was going to jail because he was going to get arrested for possession and he was on probation and he was screwed. And so he just begins crying and pleading with police to understand that the cocaine was not his. He swears it's not his. Meanwhile, Dahlia, she's looking at the drugs and now she's second guessing herself. Is Michael lying? Is he actually selling drugs? And he's been lying to me too? But when she sees her husband crying hysterically and looking so sincere, she believes that he's got to be telling the truth. And so pretty soon she was standing beside Michael and pleading with police as well to let them go, that this was totally just a setup. And amazingly, these police officers who were aware of the previous raids on Michael and Dahlia's property, they told them, look, we do think this is pretty suspicious that somebody keeps calling in about you selling drugs and now magically the drugs are in your car. And so what we're going to do is we're going to confiscate this cocaine. We're not going to arrest you. Instead, go home, be safe, call us if you see anything strange, you hear anything strange, and we're going to begin investigating to figure out who is making all of these calls. And so Michael and Dahlia were totally relieved to hear this, but at the same time, they were kind of terrified because clearly whoever was looking to get Michael in trouble now was prepared to break into his property in order to do it. And so what was stopping them from breaking into their condo and planting drugs in there as well? And so after these police officers left, Michael and Dahlia hopped in the car, they sped back to their condo and they went inside and they searched it top to bottom, looking for any sign that anyone had recently been in there or if there were drugs or anything illegal inside of their condo. And after looking and finding nothing, they just locked their doors, shut their windows, shut the blinds, and just prayed that the police would be able to quickly identify who was doing this to them and make them stop. But over the next few months, the police would not figure out who this anonymous caller was because the caller stopped calling. And so for a little while, Michael and Dahlia were convinced that the whole ordeal was over and done with, and they basically returned to their normal lives. But on August 5th, 2009, roughly 4 months after the cocaine was found in Michael's car, the anonymous caller would come back with a vengeance. On that morning at around 5:45 a.m., Dahlia left the condo, leaving Michael in bed, and she headed out to the local gym to get a workout in. Around 6:30 in the morning, she stepped off the treadmill and she looked at her phone and she saw she had a missed call from a number she didn't recognize, and this number had left her a voicemail. And so she calls her voicemail, she puts it to her ear, and as she's listening, her heart starts to race because it was a Boynton Beach detective telling her there had been some sort of incident at her condo and she needed to come back right away. Terrified, Dahlia grabbed her things and she ran out of the gym, she got in her car, and she called this number back. And when the detective picked up, she tried to get more information from him about what this incident was, what happened. And the detective would only say that it involved her husband, and he would explain everything when she came back. And so in a total state of shock, Dahlia turned on her car and she sped out of the parking lot and she headed back towards her condo. And when she turned onto her street and saw her condo, she hit the brakes and just stared. In front of her condo were all these police cars with their lights on, and police officers were walking around, and yellow crime scene tape was lining the outside of her property. And inside of the taped off area, there were all these crime scene photographers taking pictures of her condo. And so as Dahlia is sitting in her car at the top of the street, just staring at this crazy scene she's seeing, one of the Boynton Beach police officers sees her and walks up, and after confirming that she was Dahlia DiPolito, he said to her, leave your car here and come with me. And so Dahlia, who knows obviously something bad has happened but really doesn't know the extent of it, she puts her car in park, she gets out, and she begins walking with this police officer over towards this cluster of 3 people that are standing right in front of her property. And it would turn out one of them was the detective who had called her on the phone. And so Dahlia's led over, and that detective, as soon as he sees Dahlia, he walks over to her and he says to her very matter-of-factly that someone had called about a disturbance in their condo, and shots were fired, and unfortunately her husband, Michael, was dead. Dahlia, who was totally hysterical, was gently led away from her condo into a nearby police car, and they would drive her to the police station where they would sit her down and begin asking her questions about her husband. And they would say to her, look, I know you just found this out, but we gotta figure out what could have happened because a killer is on the loose. We need to find this person and stop them. And so at first, the conversation was really just Dahlia crying and the detective kind of calming her down. But eventually, she would tell the detective about the anonymous caller who kept calling the police and claiming Michael was selling drugs, and how she and Michael suspected that, probably the anonymous caller was connected to someone from his past, maybe someone from the mafia, or maybe one of the victims of his boiler room scam, or it could be any number of other people that Michael had done wrong in the past. And so the detective, he's taking diligent notes and he's listening to Dahlia, and then at some point in a break in the conversation, he says to Dahlia, okay, it's time to get serious. I need to know if you know this guy. And so Dahlia, she was kind of looking down and she looks up, confused what he's talking about. And then the door opens and this huge guy in handcuffs walks into the room.
Come here. Bring this guy in here. Get over here. Get over here. You know who this guy is?
No.
You've never seen him before?
I've never seen him before. Ever.
Do you know her?
Put your head up and look at her.
Put your head up.
I've never seen him.
What were you doing coming out of her house? Get him out of here.
It would turn out Dahlia was lying. She did know who that guy was. Almost immediately after marrying Michael 6 months earlier, she had stolen $200,000 from him, but apparently that wasn't enough for her. She needed the rest of Michael's money as well as his condo. And so she had been the anonymous caller. She was the one calling the police and tipping them off that Michael was selling drugs out of the condo and out of his car. She was the one who planted the cocaine in the back of his car because she wanted him to get arrested because he was on probation and he would go back to jail for a really long time. But when her efforts failed and Michael did not get arrested and so did not go back to jail, Dahlia moved on to plan B. She reached out to one of her ex-boyfriends and she asked him, "Hey, do you know any hitmen that could murder my husband?" And the ex-boyfriend at first didn't think she was serious, but when she kept asking him about it and began offering to pay and really was making it clear that she wasn't joking around, the ex-boyfriend basically told her, "No, I don't know any hitmen." And then he, the ex-boyfriend, called the Boynton Beach Police Department and told them about Dahlia and her plan to hire a hitman to kill Michael. And so when the Boynton Beach Police Department found out about this plot, they immediately had one of their undercover agents pose as a hitman and set up a meeting with Dahlia. And so the undercover agent was that huge guy in handcuffs that was led into the room with Dahlia. And so Dahlia goes to meet the undercover agent, the fake hitman. She gets into his car and there's a hidden camera in the back seat that's filming her the whole time. And she's caught on camera saying she wants to kill her husband. She gives money to the undercover agent. And then as she's about to get out, the agent turns to her and he says, "Are you sure you want to do this? Because as soon as you leave, it's done. I am going to kill Michael and you can't stop it." This is Dahlia's reaction.
There's no changing, no, there's no, like, I'm determined already. I'm positive, like, 5,000% sure, like, no, when I say I'm going to do something, I'm going to do it. Like, as soon as you told me, listen, I need the money from you, I went, I grabbed it right away, like, we were good to go. Like, with me, you're not going to have a problem, you're not going to have an issue.
And so the Boynton Beach Police Department, they have all this information about what Dahlia thinks is going to happen, and they decide they can use this information to set her up in the most elaborate way possible. And it just so happened the very popular true crime TV show, Cops, was filming in the area. And so the Boynton Beach Police Department allowed Cops to be a part of this elaborate setup. So they got to film everything that happened. So on the morning of August 5th, Dahlia got up and left her condo at 5:45 a.m. and headed to the gym, knowing, at least in her mind, that the hitman would be coming to her condo right after her, breaking in and shooting her husband twice in the head, because that was the plan they had come up with that was captured on film. And so after the police see her leave at 5:45 a.m., because they were monitoring the condo, they rushed in, they knocked on the door, and they got Michael to come downstairs. And he had no idea his wife was trying to kill him. And so he comes to the door, he's totally confused, but he goes with them and he's kind of ushered off to the police station. And then for about the next hour, the police set up a very convincing fake crime scene right out front of the condo. And then once it was all set up, that detective called Dahlia and left her a voicemail saying that, there's been this incident, you need to come back to your condo. And then a couple of minutes later, when Dahlia called them back and said, "Okay, I'm coming back to the condo now," that's when the TV crews for the Cops TV show, they kind of set up in the bushes and got ready to film what happened next.
Listen, we had a report of a disturbance at your house, and there were shots fired. Is your husband Michael? Okay, I'm sorry to tell you, man, he's been killed. He's been killed, man. I'm sorry.
No, he's not.
Listen.
No.
Try to calm down. Listen, right now what we need to get you to the station.
No.
We need to get you to our police station.
I want to see him.
I can't let you in, man. We have to do our job.
After the fake hitman was pulled out of the interrogation room after Dahlia had said, "Oh, I don't know who he is," the detective just stared at her in total silence for a minute. And then he broke the news that he totally knew all about her murder plot and that she was going to jail.
You're going to jail today for solicitation of murder. You're under arrest. That's an undercover police officer. Everything has been recorded. You were photographed in the convertible when you sat in his car in the front of CVS. What do you want to do? What do you want to do here?
I didn't do
Dahlia?
anything.
Listen to me.
I didn't do anything.
You're going to
I
jail.
didn't do anything, please. I didn't do anything.
Tell me you didn't do anything.
I didn't do anything.
You're going to jail today. As soon as I'm done, they're going to come in here and handcuff you and take you to the Palm Beach County Jail, book you for solicitation of first-degree murder on your husband. Your husband is well and alive.
Thank God.
Oh, yeah, thank God.
Please? Can I see him?
No, he doesn't want to see you.
I so wanted to see him.
He doesn't want to see you.
Please.
After Dahlia was arrested, she was still sitting in that interrogation room when the Boynton Beach Police Department made a special point of walking Dahlia's husband, Michael, past the open door so she could see him. Here's her reaction.
Oh my God. please. Come here. Mike, come here. Come here, please. Come here.
Can't fix it.
Why not? I didn't do anything
I
to
heard
you.
you.
Mike, come here, please. Come here.
Okay, Mike, we'll take her back to booking, please.
Dahlia was initially sentenced to 20 years in prison for what she had done, but after a retrial because of jury bias, her sentence was reduced to 16 years. So that's going to do it. If you got something out of today's episode and you haven't done this already, please ask the like button if you can borrow their car for the week, and then spend that week driving around picking up as much roadkill as you possibly can and packing it into their trunk and into their back seat, and then return their car. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly 1 or 2 video uploads. We now have a podcast called MrBallen Podcast, and we put out brand new, never before heard podcast exclusive episodes on Monday mornings. And then on Thursday mornings, we put out remastered audio from popular YouTube videos. Again, it's called MrBallen Podcast, and it's available on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Amazon, Google, basically anywhere you get your podcasts, you can find it there. We have 2 additional YouTube channels. One is called MrBallen Shorts, where we upload random short videos and lost episodes. And the other channel is called MrBallen en Español, and it's a Spanish language channel. We also have a Facebook page just called MrBallen that puts out near daily content. We also have a Snapchat channel called MrBallen that puts out content on Sundays. We also have some really cool merchandise, so head on over to shopmrballen.com to have a look. And if you have a story suggestion, please submit it to our subreddit just called MrBallen. It's linked in the description below. So whether I see you on Instagram, Twitter, TikTok, Reddit, YouTube, Facebook, other YouTube channels, the podcast, wherever, just know that I really appreciate your support. And until next time, that's going to do it. See ya. In 1994, a 31-year-old mother was rushed into an emergency room in California with a severely elevated heart rate, her blood pressure was very low, and she was struggling to breathe. As soon as she arrived, the doctors and nurses in this ER, who were very accustomed to getting patients like her, got right to work. And as they're treating her, one of the doctors noticed something very strange about the patient. But before this doctor could tell the other nurses and doctors about this anomaly, there was this loud thud inside of the trauma room they were inside of. And then before long, there was another thud, and then someone started screaming, and then minutes later, the entire hospital would be evacuated. But before we get into that story, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right place, because that's all we do, and we upload once a week. So, if that's of interest to you, please sneak in to the like button's house and set all of their clocks back 1 hour. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. Okay, let's get into today's story. On the night of February 19th, 1994, a man in Southern California called 911 because his girlfriend was struggling to breathe. When the 911 dispatcher picked up this man's call, he was very distraught and asked them to please send an ambulance as fast as you possibly can. But despite how upset this man was on the phone, he was not actually surprised this situation was unfolding. His girlfriend, 31-year-old Gloria Ramirez, had been diagnosed with terminal cervical cancer just 6 weeks earlier, and the doctors had told her that she likely did not have much time left. And, making this even more tragic, Gloria had actually gone into the hospital a few years earlier with symptoms and signs that she likely had cancer, but the doctors missed it. Had they caught it back then, they likely could have saved her. Still, after receiving her very grim diagnosis just a few weeks earlier, Gloria had resolved to fight her cancer as best as she could. After all, she had a lot to lose. Gloria had 2 young kids. She had a boy and a girl who were 9 and 12 years old respectively. And Gloria absolutely adored them and really devoted her life to them. In the evenings, she would play with them and help them with their homework, and the whole time she'd be cracking jokes to make them laugh and smile. And then even when Gloria was not actively parenting her kids, she was always a very positive presence in their lives. She was optimistic, she was happy, she was upbeat, and oftentimes she could be found wandering around with a big smile on her face, singing a religious hymn to herself. So, when Gloria got this terrible news that she had late-stage cancer, she was obviously terrified and sad, but she was also very determined to find a way to survive because she knew her kids still needed her. Around the time Gloria was diagnosed, her doctors told her she would begin radiation treatment for her cancer at the end of February, so she had a few weeks to wait. And so during this waiting period, Gloria found herself spending a lot of time researching her disease, looking for things she could be doing on her own right now to make herself feel better, or even potentially increase the odds of her survival. So, on February 19th, when Gloria told her boyfriend that she was starting to have some issues breathing, the boyfriend didn't hesitate for a second to call 911 because he knew firsthand from living with Gloria that she was desperate to survive, and so any changes in her symptoms needed to be treated like an emergency. It was around 8 p.m. that night when the ambulance pulled up in front of Gloria's home. Paramedics climbed out, they rushed over to Gloria, they put her on a stretcher, they gave her a mask with oxygen, and then they loaded her into the back of the ambulance, and then seconds later, they were flying down the road with their sirens blaring. While they sped toward the hospital in Riverside, which is a city about an hour east of Los Angeles, one of the paramedics on board the ambulance called ahead to the Riverside Hospital emergency room to talk to one of the doctors. And the doctor who answered was a 33-year-old woman named Dr. Julie Gorczynski, and she loved her job. She loved the thrill and excitement and challenge of working in a big city emergency room. And so she takes this call. The paramedics tell her that they have a patient who has terminal cancer. She's having a hard time breathing, and her heart rate is becoming very unstable to the point where if it's not controlled soon, it's going to kill her. And they told Julie they would be there in about 5 minutes. And so Julie, she hangs up the phone and immediately began preparing for receiving a critical patient, as well as getting trauma room 1 ready, which is where Gloria would be treated. Now, as bad as this situation was for Gloria, for Julie and the other nurses and doctors in this emergency room, this was kind of business as usual. They were used to receiving patients that were in very rough shape. And so as Julie and the rest of her medical team waited for this ambulance to arrive, none of them were worried that they wouldn't be able to handle this patient. They thought tonight was going to be as routine as any other night. However, they would be very, very wrong. The ambulance ride took about 15 minutes, so they pulled into the Riverside Hospital right at 8:15 p.m. And as soon as the ambulance came to a stop, the paramedics jumped out, they ran around to the back, they opened up the back doors, they pulled Gloria out still on her stretcher, and they pushed her as fast as they could through the doors into the emergency room. Once inside, Julie and the rest of her team, they took Gloria and they pushed her left down a hallway into trauma room 1. Once inside, the doctors and nurses immediately noticed that Gloria's heart rate was spiking dramatically and her blood pressure was falling dramatically. So, Julie and her team began administering a standard set of treatments for someone in this condition. They switched Gloria's oxygen mask she had been using on the ambulance ride for a more powerful one. They gave her painkillers, sedatives, and drugs to help steady her heartbeat. And at first, the treatments seemed to be working because pretty quickly Gloria's heartbeat began to level out. However, it didn't last. Soon, Gloria's heartbeat was racing so insanely fast that all of these alarms were going off on her heartbeat monitor. Knowing they had to act quickly, Julie and her team began removing Gloria's t-shirt in order to administer electric shocks to her chest with paddles. This is a way for doctors to kind of reset a patient's heartbeat. As the nurses got the electric paddles ready, they and the rest of the medical team suddenly noticed two strange things about Gloria. The first was that Gloria seemed to be emitting this strange garlicky smell from her mouth. The second was Gloria's skin looked very greasy. However, despite the entire medical team taking note of these two things, no one thought they were significant. Lots of patients suddenly are brought into the ER, and very rarely do they have a chance to shower or brush their teeth beforehand. And so they figured that was the reason she looked and smelled that way. Finally, the big electrical paddles were ready, and so the nurses placed them on either side of Gloria's heart, and then they began sending powerful bolts of electricity into Gloria's chest. While the nurses worked on Gloria's heart, other members of the medical team needed to assess Gloria's overall condition, and so to do that, they needed to draw her blood. So a nurse took an alcohol wipe and cleaned a small spot on Gloria's arm, and then she took a syringe and jabbed it inside of Gloria and began the draw. And as soon as she did this, Trauma Room 1 filled with a new smell. It was a chemical smell. And Julie immediately noticed it, and she looked over at the nurse doing the blood draw, and she said, "I think it smells like ammonia in here." And the nurse, who was doing the blood draw, kind of scrunched her face up in disgust and nodded in agreement. The nurse finished the blood draw and then handed the blood vial to Julie. And as Julie was taking this blood vial from the nurse, she noticed the nurse looked suddenly very confused and very disoriented. Her eyes were kind of flickering and she was staring straight ahead like she didn't know where she was. And so Julie, she sees this in the nurse, and then she glances down at this blood vial in her own hand now, and she sees something she's never seen before. The blood inside this vial, Gloria's blood, was full of these small white crystals. But before Julie could tell anybody else in the room about these strange crystals in the patient's blood, the nurse who had done the blood draw went from being dazed and confused to collapsing on the ground. Luckily, another doctor had seen the nurse starting to collapse and dove out and caught her right before her head hit the ground. This collapsed nurse was very quickly placed on a stretcher and wheeled out of Trauma Room 1 so the other doctors and nurses could focus on Gloria, who was obviously dying. And so Julie, who was still just standing in the middle of this room holding this vial of blood, was wondering what the heck just happened to her colleague. And she's also looking down at these crystals thinking, I've never seen this before. What does this mean? And right as she was about to flag one of the other medical team members over to look at it, Julie began feeling very nauseous and her head started spinning. And then she felt like she might collapse. And so not wanting to cause any more distractions for the main team, she quickly placed this vial of blood on a nearby tray. And then she quickly made her way out of Trauma Room 1 and sat down in a nearby chair. And as soon as she sat down, another staff member at the hospital who had not been inside of the trauma room ran over to Julie and asked her, hey, are you okay? And Julie, she looked up at the staff member and she tried to speak, but she couldn't. And then her eyes rolled back into her skull and she slumped forward and fell to the ground. And at the same moment that Julie was collapsing outside of Trauma Room 1, inside of the trauma room, there was another thud as another nurse collapsed, and then another, and then another. And before long, screams were coming out of Trauma Room 1 as people inside who had not collapsed yet are looking around, seeing their colleagues just dropping like flies for no reason. And so pretty quickly, the call came out over the hospital intercom to evacuate the hospital. The only people that would stay back would be a skeleton crew of doctors and nurses and Gloria, because they felt like moving Gloria outside right now would likely kill her. We need to save her right now. Outside the hospital, the parking lot very quickly filled up with doctors and nurses and other sick people on stretchers. People were screaming and crying, sirens were blaring, and the medical staff that was still healthy was running all over the place looking for supplies to help treat their coworkers. Meanwhile, back inside of Trauma Room 1, things for Gloria only seemed to be getting worse. The 4 doctors and nurses who had stayed back continued to administer more drugs, more shocks to her chest, more oxygen, but no matter what they did, her blood pressure continued to fall and her heartbeat became fainter and fainter and fainter. Finally, at 8:50 p.m., roughly 35 minutes after Gloria had first been wheeled into the emergency room, she died. In that 35-minute window, 23 of Riverside Hospital staff had either collapsed or become very sick and then collapsed, and many of them had to be hospitalized. But the most affected person by far was Julie. She was in such bad shape by the time she made it out to the parking lot that she was actually put on an ambulance from her hospital and driven to another hospital where she was admitted to their intensive care unit. And there, a nurse drew her blood, and in it were little white crystals, just like in Gloria's blood. At 11 p.m. on the same night all this craziness happened, a hazardous materials team dressed in full hazmat suits entered the Riverside Hospital to look for a chemical leak, because that was the running theory that some sort of leak had happened in the hospital, it had made its way into Trauma Room 1, and that's what had caused everyone to collapse and get sick. But despite an extensive search, the hazmat team did not find any leaks. Stumped, authorities decided to just be extra careful around this hospital and around Gloria's body until they figured out what had happened, because the fear was there was some sort of unknown or hidden toxin either in this building or on or in Gloria's body. 6 days after the incident, inside of a special airtight room, while wearing full body protective suits, doctors performed an autopsy on Gloria. And they discovered there was absolutely nothing toxic inside of her. In fact, the autopsy only revealed that Gloria had died of natural causes. Her cancer had caused her heart and her kidneys to fail. Meanwhile, although the other medical staff members who had gotten sick inside of Trauma Room 1 had mostly recovered, Julie just could not seem to get any better. She had breathing problems and pancreatitis, which is the inflammation of the pancreas, and it's very painful. And her bones were literally just starting to die, leaving her in a wheelchair. Gloria's family blamed Riverside Hospital for Gloria's death, insisting that these toxic fumes that must have been present inside of Trauma Room 1 came from the hospital, and those fumes are responsible for what happened to the staff, and they are responsible for killing Gloria. And in fact, 3 times in the 3 years leading up to Gloria's death, Riverside Hospital had had some issues with hazardous materials making their way into the hospital. There was sewer gas that came in from a drain. There was a toxic gas that was created from a sterilizer that made 2 people in the hospital sick, and some of the hospital's water was found to have algae in it. But the hospital said they checked their hospital, there was no leak, we did not cause whatever toxic fumes were inside of Trauma Room 1, and so we are not responsible for what happened to our staff or what happened to Gloria. Riverside Hospital would be searched again and again for some sort of leak. Also, Gloria's home would be searched for toxic gases, and Gloria would be autopsied 2 additional times. But no one could find anything toxic anywhere. So eventually, California's Department of Human and Health Services came forward and said they had the answer to what had happened inside of Trauma Room 1. They said it was mass sociogenic illness. Mass sociogenic illness is when a group of people all believe they have the same illness, even though there's nothing wrong with any of them. It's caused by fear and anxiety. Basically, the state of California was saying that Julie and the other 22 staff members who had gotten sick and collapsed had just pretended. They were making it up. As for Gloria, they said she just died from her cancer. Now, of course, this explanation made a lot of people unhappy, like Gloria's family, and of course Julie, whose medical problems were very well documented. She couldn't walk anymore because her bones were literally dying. And so Gloria's family and Julie said, you know what, we think the hospital is covering something up and we are going to sue. But before they did, an obscure lab located just outside of San Francisco, California, it was called the Forensic Science Center, was called in to do yet another investigation into what happened inside of Riverside Hospital. And what these scientists found would make history. Here is what they discovered. After Gloria was diagnosed with cancer, she began researching not only her disease, but also alternative treatments that she could do on her own before she began her radiation treatment at the end of February. And according to the scientists of Forensic Science Center, Gloria must have begun using a well-known controversial home remedy to help with her pain. It was called dimethyl sulfoxide, or DMSO for short. In the 1960s, DMSO was prescribed to treat pain and anxiety, but as it became more popular, it was discovered that it could cause eye damage, and so the government said, you can't use this anymore. But even though DMSO was no longer available as a medicine, it was still being sold in gel form inside of hardware stores as a heavy-duty degreaser. And it was this type of DMSO, the gel form, that Gloria had begun rubbing all over her skin, head to toe. This was the reason when she arrived in the emergency room, her skin looked greasy because she was literally covered head to toe in this gel. It was also why her breath smelled like garlic, because after DMSO is absorbed into your bloodstream, you emit a sort of garlicky smell both through your pores and out of your mouth. But the discovery that Gloria had been using DMSO did not account for why all these people in the hospital began collapsing and falling ill when they were around her. It turned out on the night that Gloria's boyfriend called 911 because Gloria was suffering from breathing problems, Gloria was also suffering from another medical issue, but it was so minor, the boyfriend didn't think to bring it up to the 911 dispatcher or to the paramedics when they arrived. And this secret medical condition that Gloria had was a urinary tract infection, which is an infection in any part of the urinary system. These are very common and usually very easy to treat. But what nobody realized was that because Gloria had this infection, her body was not flushing out the DMSO chemicals that had seeped inside of it from all this gel on her skin. Still, even very large amounts of DMSO chemicals inside of your body or on your skin is not enough to cause any harm to you or people around you. The danger started when the EMTs in the ambulance put that oxygen mask on Gloria's face as they transported her to the hospital. Suddenly, there was this new chemical being introduced into Gloria's body, oxygen. And the scientists from the Forensic Science Center said this new chemical, oxygen, began interacting with the DMSO chemicals trapped inside of Gloria's body, and together they formed a new chemical. Now, if Gloria had gotten to the hospital and responded more positively to the treatments and medicines that the doctors and nurses at the ER gave her, then Julie and the rest of the staff inside of that hospital would never have gotten sick. For that to happen, for that catastrophe to play out inside of that hospital, two very specific things had to happen in the correct order. And they did. First, there was the electric shocks. When the medical team was pumping electrical shocks into Gloria's chest, the scientists from the Forensic Science Center say those charges of electricity interacted with that new chemical that had been created inside of Gloria, and it changed this new chemical again. And this time, the change made the chemical deadly. It became what's known as dimethyl sulfate, which was used as a chemical weapon in World War I. Once Gloria received those shocks to her chest, her body basically became a canister of nerve gas. And then one of the nurses drew Gloria's blood, which was the second event that ultimately set off the catastrophe. Emergency rooms are typically kept fairly cold, roughly 66 degrees Fahrenheit. But when this new deadly chemical was created inside of Gloria, it was still inside of her body where it was warm. And for dimethyl sulfate, when it is warm, it's unstable and much less dangerous. But when that nurse drew Gloria's blood, inside of the blood was the deadly chemical, and now it was no longer in Gloria, it was in this cool 66-degree room, and so it began to stabilize and started producing those little white crystals inside of the blood vial that Julie saw, and as it stabilized, it turned into a gas, and it filled the room, and the staff began to breathe it in. The scientists from the Forensic Science Center do not think that this mass poisoning event contributed to Gloria's death, meaning Gloria did really die from her cancer. Gloria's family has denied that Gloria ever used DMSO, and they still insist that the hospital was responsible for Gloria's death. The hospital would ultimately pay $800,000 in settlement money to Gloria's family, but the hospital would never admit that they did anything wrong. Julie's lawsuit against the hospital was ultimately dismissed, and her bones never really recovered from the damage that was done to them, despite 8 surgeries to try to fix them. However, Julie would eventually go back to being a practicing doctor at another hospital, and she has said the ordeal she went through inside of Trauma Room 1 at Riverside Hospital actually made her a better doctor. So that's going to do it. If you got something out of today's episode and you haven't done this already, please sneak into the Like Button's house and set all of their clocks back 1 hour. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. We have a podcast called the MrBallen Podcast that puts out brand new podcast exclusive stories on Monday mornings, and on Thursday mornings, we put up remastered audio of our best YouTube videos. Again, it's just called the MrBallen Podcast, and it's available exclusively on Amazon Music. Consider donating to our charity. It's called the MrBallen Foundation, and it provides support to victims of violent crime as well as their families. Monthly donors to the MrBallen Foundation Honor Them Society will receive free gifts and exclusive invites to special live events. Go to MrBallen.Foundation and click on Get Involved to join the Honor Them Society today. We have 2 additional YouTube channels, MrBallen Shorts and MrBallen en Espanol. We post near daily content on TikTok, Facebook, and Snapchat. All of those pages are just called MrBallen. If you want to get in touch with me, please follow me on any major social media platform and then send me a direct message. My username is just @MrBallen, and I really do read the majority of my DMs. Check out our merch at shopmrballen.com, and if you have a story suggestion, please submit it to our subreddit just called MrBallen. It's linked in the description below. So whether I see you on Instagram, Twitter, TikTok, Reddit, YouTube, Facebook, other YouTube channels, the podcast, wherever, just know that I really appreciate your support, and until next time, that's going to do it. See ya. This story is going to be painful to listen to. It's a horrific tragedy, and there's really no other way to tell it without it coming off that way. And so viewer discretion is advised. But before we get into today's story, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right place, because that's all we do, and we upload 3 or 4 times every week. So if that's of interest to you, please go into the Like Button's favorite music playlist and replace all of the songs with the Kids Bop version of them. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. All right, let's get into today's story. In the early 1960s, 2 high school classmates in South Carolina named Carol and Reggie fell in love with each other. Every day in the halls, they'd hold hands and they'd laugh with each other and whisper to each other, and then outside of school, they were inseparable. But despite their seemingly perfect relationship, it didn't last long. They both had different ideas about what the future should hold, and so after graduation, they broke up. Reggie went on to join the US Navy, where he served for a number of years all over the world. He would at one point get married, but that marriage would end quickly, and then after he got out of the military, he got a job at a railroad back at his hometown in South Carolina. As for Carol, after graduation, she got married and divorced too, twice actually, but it was her second failed marriage that nearly killed her. On February 18th, 1987, Carol was living with her 10-year-old daughter, Rhonda, in South Carolina when her estranged second husband came up to the door and knocked. Carol opened the door, and her ex-husband drew a gun and shot her 6 times in front of her daughter before turning around and fleeing. The police would later find his body inside of his car on the side of the road. He had shot himself. As for Carol, the doctors were able to save her life, but the injuries she sustained from the attack were crippling. She was blind in one eye and she had chronic pain, and so her young daughter had to start taking care of her full time. Over the next 8 years, Carol steadily improved and regained some of her independence, but in 1995, she had a huge setback. She started feeling ill, and so she went in to see a doctor, and the doctor did a blood test, and they discovered she had liver cancer. It would turn out the blood that was given to her after the attack, that had been transfused into her body to save her life, it had been tainted with hepatitis C. And so she got hepatitis C without realizing it, and because it had been untreated, it led to liver cancer. Rhonda remembers when her mother came home after being given this terrible news, she just sat down and was silent for a minute, and then she just kind of muttered to herself, I just can't get away from this man. He's killing me all over again. But despite being dealt such an unfair hand in life, Carol was determined to not let her injuries or her illness define her. And so she went out looking for a job that could accommodate her physical limitations, and she found it. She was hired as a part-time customer service rep for a television cable company. She was very happy about this job and very proud of it because it was the first time she was working after the attack, and so for once it felt like her life was going back to normal again. A few years later, in 2000, when Carol was working at the cable company, her phone rang and she answered it the way she answered every other call, but the voice she heard on the other end, she immediately recognized. He introduced himself as Reggie Sumner, and so Carol asked him, are you the Reggie Sumner from 1962 at Garrett High School in South Carolina? And he said, yeah, that's me. And Carol said, I'm your ex-girlfriend. We dated in high school. And so it was this incredible reunion, this totally chance phone call. And for the next hour or so, they just chatted on the phone about everything from their kids to their relationships they've been in to what they're up to now. I mean, they had a lot to catch up on since they hadn't seen or heard from each other in nearly 40 years. And so before they hung up, they realized they lived near each other, and so they made plans to get together in person. Rhonda would say her mother, when she came home that night, was like a 16-year-old girl all over again. She talked endlessly about how great Reggie was and how good-looking he was and how excited she was about their upcoming date. And so a couple of days later, Carol and Reggie have this date, and when Carol comes home, Rhonda would say it was obvious her mother had fallen head over heels in love with Reggie all over again. And luckily, Reggie had fallen in love with Carol too, because less than 6 months later, they got married and became Mr. and Mrs. Sumner. Within a year of their marriage, they decided to sell their home in South Carolina and move to Jacksonville, Florida to retire. Even though caring for her mother for all those years had been quite difficult for Rhonda, she said she was very sad to see her mother go, but at the same time, she was really happy for her because it seemed like she had found the one. Over the next couple of years, Rhonda stayed in touch with her mother, speaking to her almost every single day on the phone. But in July of 2005, Rhonda's mother stopped answering her phone. At first, Rhonda wasn't that concerned, but after 24 hours of not hearing from her mother or from Reggie, she did get concerned. Because even though Reggie was able to care for Carol, he wasn't in the best shape himself. He had debilitating diabetes, and he had recently broken his leg, and so was largely confined to a wheelchair. And so if they were to leave their house for an extended period of time, they wouldn't do it without asking for help from Rhonda. And so over the next couple of days, Rhonda incessantly called her mother and called Reggie, but she never got through to them. And so finally, after almost 72 hours of not hearing from them, she decides to just hop in her car and drive the 4 hours to Jacksonville to check on them personally. When she got there, she saw her mother and Reggie's car was not in the driveway like it normally would be. And so Rhonda went up to the front door and she knocked and she's yelling for her mom, but nobody's coming to the door, even though lights are on inside the house. And so Rhonda eventually tries the handle of the door and it's open. And so she opens it up, she steps inside, she yells again for her mom and for Reggie, but no one yells back. And then she sees their beloved dog, Mikey, that they brought everywhere with them, was still in the house. And so she's thinking, where would they have gone without bringing Mikey? And so Rhonda continues to walk through the house into the kitchen. And when she gets there, she sees on the table are 2 plates of food where the food looks like it's a couple of days old and it's just sitting on the plate like they had been eating it and then just abandoned it there. And then in the sink are all these dirty dishes. And then on the stove are half-cooked pots of food. And Rhonda knows her mother is an extremely tidy person and she never would have left her house with dirty dishes and food out on the table. And so red flags are going up for Rhonda. But what ultimately sealed the deal for her was when she turned and looked on one of the counters, she saw the cell phone that Reggie and Carol shared was still sitting there along with Carol's purse. And then next to that was both of their medications, which was Reggie's insulin and Carol's liver cancer medication, both of which were life-saving and needed to be taken every single day. There's no way they would have left the house without those things. And so Rhonda immediately calls the Jacksonville Police Department and she files a missing person report. And before long, the missing couple's story is all over the news and all of the networks are asking people if they have information to come forward, but no one came forward. And so the only lead the police had was to track down the Sumner's car, which was missing from their driveway when Rhonda showed up at their house. So the police shared the description of their vehicle all across the state, and very quickly they got a hit. The car had been found abandoned in a Florida town about 1 hour west of Jacksonville. It had been parked in this semi-forested, very secluded area off of a dirt road, and there was nothing inside of it, but they saw the battery had been taken out, leading some of the officers to speculate that perhaps the Sumners really had just driven away from their home without telling anybody and then ran into car troubles. But that theory would quickly be thrown out the window when 5 hours later, the Jacksonville police received a very strange phone call. The man who called in said he was Reggie Sumner, and he said he had seen the news about him and his wife being missing and that was just totally not true, that in reality they had left, but they were just fine and they'd be back soon. The police are immediately suspicious of this person. They don't think it's Reggie Sumner because, for one, he sounds like a young man and Reggie is a 61-year-old, and so the voice didn't really line up, and just the way he was talking about this disappearance like it was no big deal, that also just didn't really make sense. And so one of the officers asked Reggie, "Are you with your wife Carol?" And he said, "Yep, I'm with her, here she is." And so a woman hops on the phone who says she's Carol Sumner, but she sounds far too young to be Carol Sumner, who's 61. This sounds like a 18, 19, 20-year-old girl, and she too just reiterates that everything's just fine and they've gone out for a couple of days, there's nothing to worry about, and you police can stop looking for us. And so after this call ends, the police at this point are convinced that this simply cannot be Carol and Reggie. But to make sure, they call in Rhonda and they have her listen to the recording of this conversation with the so-called Reggie and Carol, and right away Rhonda says, "That's not my mom and that's not Reggie." And so at this point, the police assumed that these two people who called in pretending to be the Sumners probably had something to do with the disappearance of the real Sumners. And so while they waited for the trace on this phone call to come back, which would give them information about who was calling and from where, the police decided to investigate another angle. The police looked at the Sumners' bank statements and they saw their bank card had been used at an ATM in South Carolina after the Sumners had been reported missing. And so they called that bank and they asked for the CCTV footage from that ATM. And when they watched it, they saw that it was not Carol or Reggie Sumner withdrawing funds. It was some unknown man in his early 20s. Right after this discovery of this unknown man, the trace from the phone conversation with the imposter Sumners came back, except it was tied to a fake name at a fake address. So that wasn't helpful to the police in their investigation. However, when they went through this cell phone's call logs, which they got with the phone trace, they saw whoever owned the cell phone had recently placed a call to a car rental company in South Carolina. And so the police call this car rental company and they speak to the manager and they're able to figure out that somebody using this cell phone number had indeed called and had rented a car, and the car they rented matched the description of the car the unknown man was driving in the ATM surveillance footage. But this car had been rented to a woman. Her name was Tiffany Cole. The rental company told police that all of their cars had satellite tracking information built into them. And so police were able to use that information to track Tiffany's rental car to a motel in South Carolina. The initial thought was that maybe the Sumners are being held against their will in this motel. And so very quickly, a police force was organized, and on the morning of July 14th, so 6 days after the Sumners were listed as missing, they arrive at this motel, they go to the front desk, they find out what room Tiffany is in, they get the key, and they go up and they open the door. The Sumners were not inside. Instead, there were 3 young adults sitting there. It was 24-year-old Tiffany Cole, her boyfriend, 23-year-old Michael James Jackson, and his friend, 19-year-old Alan Wade. Also in the room were dozens of bags of recently purchased merchandise, like computers and video games and clothes and perfume, and also they discovered the key to the Sumners' vehicle and Reggie Sumner's prized coin collection. The police brought all 3 back to the police station and put them in separate rooms to be interrogated. At this point, it was obvious to police that these 3 had something to do with the Sumners' disappearance. They had all these things in the room that tied them to the missing couple. And so now the police, as they interrogated them, it was not so much about connecting them to the Sumners as much as it was about helping them find the Sumners. At first, all 3 of them either didn't talk or were totally uncooperative. But under intense questioning, Tiffany cracked a little bit. She said that they had robbed the Sumners, but nothing more. They didn't do anything else besides rob them. And there had been a 4th person involved in the robbery, 19-year-old Bruce Nixon, who was friends with Alan Wade. Bruce lived nearby, so the police quickly rounded him up and brought him in for questioning, and unlike the other 3, Bruce immediately caved. And the story he told about what happened to the Sumners brought many of the police that were involved in this investigation to tears. He said it all started with Tiffany. Tiffany used to be neighbors with the Sumners back when they still lived in South Carolina. Tiffany had a pretty rough upbringing and her father was permanently sick. And so the Sumners kind of took her under their wing and looked after her and built a very close relationship with her and kind of treated her like she was one of their daughters. Anything she needed, if she needed money, food, anything, they would give it to her. For example, in 2001, right before they left for Florida, they sold a car to Tiffany, but they sold it for basically nothing because they knew she didn't have any money and she really needed a car. 4 years later, in June of 2005, Tiffany was partying in Jacksonville, Florida with her new boyfriend, Michael James Jackson, when they got kicked out of the house they planned on staying in for the night. And so now they don't have a place to stay, they don't have any money, and that's when Tiffany remembers the Sumners had moved to Jacksonville and they would always help her out if she needed anything. And so the two of them drive to the Sumners' house in the middle of the night, they haven't called them, and they just knock on the door, totally uninvited, and Carol comes to the door, and when she opens it, she sees Tiffany, and immediately she's like, "Oh my goodness, I haven't seen you in so long. Come in, come in. Who are you? Oh, Michael, great to meet you. Come on inside. I'll get you food. We'll get you fed. What do you need? What can we do for you?" And so that's when Tiffany explains to them that their plans had kind of fallen through and they didn't have a place to stay that night, and would it be possible to stay with them? And so Carol and Reggie right away say, "Absolutely no problem. Tiffany, Michael, you guys are guests here. You're welcome. Stay as long as you want." And so that night, Carol cooked a big meal for them and they all sat down at the table. And at some point, Carol and Reggie talk about the sale of their house in South Carolina. And somehow it came up that they had made $99,000 in profit from this sale. And they were so happy about it because now they could really retire comfortably. And so as soon as they said that, Tiffany and Michael shot glances at each other because they knew they had to come back and rob them. The next morning, Carol and Reggie got up early, they made coffee and they made breakfast, and they were hoping that Tiffany and Michael would stick around for the day and spend some more time with them. But Tiffany and Michael were very quick to want to leave. They said, "Thank you very much, we got to hit the road." And so they left. And as soon as they get in the car, they start planning how they're going to come back and rob the Sumners and get their hands on that $99,000. 1 month later, on the evening of July 8th, after all robbery preparations have been made, Bruce Nixon and Alan Wade show up at the Sumner house and they knock on the door. When the door opens, it's Carol, and she doesn't recognize either of them, but being as kind and generous as she was, she said, "Hey boys, what can I do for you? How can I help you?" And this was exactly what Bruce and Alan were expecting based on what Tiffany told them. She said this couple would be very easy to exploit. And they tell her that their car had broken down and they needed to use her phone. And so she's a little bit skeptical, but ultimately she says, "Sure, come on in." And so Bruce and Alan go inside the house, the door shuts behind them, and as soon as it does, one of them draws a fake gun that looks very real and pointed it at Carol, while the other one began tying her up with cord and with duct tape. And so Carol begins screaming and making a bunch of noise, and Reggie, who's in the garage out of sight, he hears her. He comes running in to see what's going on, and he sees these two men who immediately attack him, and Reggie's got a broken leg, and he's already pretty weak and frail, and so he doesn't put up much of a fight. And before long, he and his wife were all taped up and restrained on the couch, and they were having duct tape wrapped around their heads until everything was covered except for a slit underneath their nose so they could breathe. And so with the couple completely under control and at the mercy of their captors, one of the men texted Michael, who was down the road with Tiffany inside of Tiffany's rental car, and the text just said, "All clear." And what that meant was Michael could now come up and help them rob the house. And so Tiffany stays down the road in the rental car. Michael makes his way up. He goes inside, and he, Bruce, and Alan proceeded to ransack the house. And while these three men are moving room to room, taking all of their valuables, Reggie and Carol are probably thinking to themselves that, you know what, this is awful, we're getting robbed, but after they take whatever they take and they leave, we'll be fine, we'll recover. But when these three men finished taking all of their valuable items, they decided that they would also take Reggie and Carol. So they stood the couple up and they marched them into the garage and they put them in the trunk of their own car. At this point, Bruce left the Sumner's house and went down the road and got in Tiffany's rental car, and Michael and Alan, they got into the Sumner's car, and the two cars met up on the road and then drove 40 minutes northwest just over the border into Georgia, where they found this access road and they went down it until they reached this very secluded section of forest. This was not just some random spot in the middle of the woods in Georgia. This was a pre-selected spot that Tiffany and the others had been out to 2 days earlier to prepare it. And what they had done to prepare was to dig a grave for the Sumners. Michael and Alan in the Sumners car drove up right next to the grave site while Tiffany and Bruce came up right behind them. And once they had all stopped, they got out of the car and they went right behind the Sumners car and they popped open the trunk. It's believed the temperature inside of that trunk was well over 100 degrees. And so Reggie and Carol were sweating profusely, and the sweat had caused their restraints to slip off their wrists and slip down off their face. And so the two of them were found holding on to each other and crying and praying. Seeing how weak they already were, the group decided they did not need to put new tape around their wrists or their face. They weren't going to go anywhere. And so they grabbed the two and they pulled them out and dumped them on the ground. It was probably around this time that the Sumners realized Tiffany was one of these four people that was doing this horrible thing to them. And I can only imagine the heartbreak they experienced. This girl that they took in under their wing, that they thought of as a daughter, was betraying them in such a heinous and horrible way. But there was no time to feel upset about it, because as soon as they were dumped on the ground, Michael grabbed Reggie and kind of threw him over to the side and said, "Sit down, don't move, or I'm going to kill you and your wife." And then the others grabbed Carol and dragged her away from her husband over to the edge of the grave, where they literally ripped the jewelry off of her face and off of her body. And then after all the jewelry was gone, they pushed her into the grave. Then they walked over to Reggie and dragged him over and threw him in with his wife. As soon as the couple was in the grave together, they repositioned themselves so they were both sitting up, one in front of the other, with Carol behind Reggie, and she threw her legs and her arms around Reggie, just kind of clutching onto him, and she buried her head into his back and she began crying. The original plan, apparently, had been to take the Sumners and put them in this grave and pretend like you were going to do something to them, to scare them into giving up all of their information, all of their banking information, and anything else that was valuable. And it worked. And so as Carol is crying into Reggie's back, Reggie is pleading with the group. He's pleading to them, "Let me give you everything I have. Whatever you need, it's yours." And so Michael said, "Give me all your ATM bank card numbers, give me your PIN numbers, everything." And so Reggie did. He gave him all the information he could possibly give to him. And then, for some reason, despite the fact that at this point, the group has taken everything of value from this poor couple, they have extracted all the valuable information they could possibly get from them. Despite that, they decide that that's not enough. They need to kill the Sumners. And they need to kill them in the worst way imaginable. They need to bury them alive. For hours, the group slowly, shovelful by shovelful, filled in this hole with Reggie and Carol sitting at the bottom begging for their lives. But the group didn't care at all. They just kept shoveling dirt down on top of them until the dirt and mud had gotten up to their necks, and the weight of the dirt was pressing in on their chests and was making it really hard to breathe. And so as Carol and Reggie are feeling this happening to them, they can feel themselves being crushed under this weight. Their cries for help become more and more desperate, but more spaced apart, because their breathing at this point is so labored, it's so hard to get a full breath that they're conserving their air at this point. And then at some point, as the dirt crept closer and closer to their mouths, they had to tilt their heads up to try to get a good breath of air. But when they did that, they began shoveling dirt directly onto their faces, causing them to choke and gag. They're inhaling this, and it's becoming nearly impossible to catch a breath. They're dying at this point. And so finally, another layer of dirt was thrown on top of them and they disappeared under the soil. But their sounds didn't go away. They continued to whimper and make sounds as more and more dirt was put down, until finally they had filled in the hole and they began packing the dirt down with the backs of their shovels. And they could hear underneath the soil still the sounds of this couple dying. This was a slow and horrible death. After the killers were done, they left the site and they took the Sumners' car and they dumped it in Florida, where it was ultimately found. And then they all piled into the rental car. They went to an ATM and pulled some of the Sumners' money out and then went on a spending spree. Here is a photo of Tiffany celebrating just hours after killing the very people that had taken her in and treated her like a daughter. After their autopsies, the medical examiner explained that both Reggie and Carol had dirt packed into their nose, into their mouths, in their throats, in their stomach, and in their lungs, meaning their actual cause of death was being buried alive. In exchange for telling investigators what happened and for leading them to the gravesite where the Sumners were, Bruce... The most famous street in arguably the most famous city in the world is Fifth Avenue in New York City. Also known as Millionaire's Row, Fifth Avenue is home to unbelievably wealthy and influential people, along with countless luxury stores and restaurants and museums. But what most people don't know about this incredible street is that it actually has a dark history. Specifically, it used to be home to something so awful, so terrifying, that it literally had to be destroyed. But before we get into that story, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right place, because that's all we do, and we upload once a week. So if that's of interest to you, please offer the like button a nice bag of chips, but be sure you crush the entire bag first. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. Okay, let's get into today's story. Just after midnight on March 9th, 1947, a man slipped out the front door of his 4-story brownstone mansion on New York City's iconic Fifth Avenue. The man was named Langley Collier. He was 61 years old, and he was a trained engineer. He was a very famous concert pianist, and he was very wealthy. But he didn't dress like he was wealthy. This night, Langley was going for an 8-mile walk to the south to Brooklyn, New York, where he was going to pick up a very specific thing that he needed for his older brother Homer, who was currently laid up in bed on the 2nd floor of the mansion. It was a freezing cold night, and so as Langley walked along the road, he flipped up his collar of his very shabby wool coat that was held together by safety pins. Nowadays, Langley felt like the only time he was safe going outside was at night, because at nighttime he could kind of hide from the prying eyes of his neighbors or police officers or really anyone. It was the one time he could basically be invisible. And so Langley scurried his way down the dimly lit sidewalk, looking left and right constantly to make sure he wasn't being followed. And then finally at 2 a.m., he arrived at his destination in Brooklyn, a very particular set of dumpsters. And right away, Langley got to work. He went in that dumpster and he got the things he was looking for and then put them in his bag, slung it over his shoulder, and then began the long, slow walk back home. Several weeks later, on March 21st, the phone rang inside the police station near where the Collier brothers lived. And so a sergeant picked up the phone, and on the other line was a guy who called himself Charles Smith, and in a very gruff voice, he told the sergeant that there was a dead body in the Collier brothers' mansion. Now, while of course this was a huge tip, the sergeant was skeptical because the police were aware of the fact that there were lots of rumors floating around about the Collier brothers. They were very eccentric. I mean, Langley's going out at night with a bag over his shoulder and going to look at dumpsters in Brooklyn. I mean, they were also kind of reclusive, and the windows outside of their mansion were boarded up with wood and metal. And so people were kind of on edge about the Collier brothers, and periodically, when they heard rumors about them, they would call the police and report it. And so the police were used to getting these rumor calls, going and checking it out, only to discover that they were not true. And so this sergeant said to Charles Smith, well, how do you know there's a dead body inside the mansion? But the caller simply didn't answer and hung up. And so because the sergeant did not necessarily believe this was a credible tip, instead of sending an entire investigative team to the mansion to check out this dead body, he asked a single police officer to, when he had time, make his way over and basically do a wellness check on the Collier brothers. And so later that day, this one lone police officer showed up to the Collier brothers' mansion. He got out of his cruiser and he just stopped and looked at the brownstone mansion. Even though it was every bit a mansion, it was not in good condition. All the windows were boarded up with wood and metal, and the glass behind them was all shattered. There was newspapers coming out of the broken windows like they had been jammed up against the inside of the windows. There was all this furniture and wooden crates and just junk piled up outside the front of the property. I mean, the place looked kind of dilapidated, and he was shocked that anybody lived in here to begin with. But the Collier family were not normal people. Langley and Homer's dad was a doctor, and he would take home pieces of real people, like parts and organs and that kind of thing, and he would put them in glass jars and put them on display all over the house. Their dad also always canoed to work, which meant walking out of the mansion with a canoe on his shoulder, walking to East River, canoeing his way in his fancy doctor clothes all the way until he got off, and then carrying the canoe to his office building. As for Langley and Homer's mother, she was the first cousin of their dad, and she also kicked their dad out of the house when he tried to convert their entire house into a sanatorium, which is kind of like a cross between a hospital and a resort for people who are recovering from tuberculosis. And so the brothers had grown up in this very odd family, and while they were totally brilliant, they were also very eccentric. Homer, the older brother, was a literal genius who was accepted to study law at the highly prestigious Ivy League University, Columbia, at the age of 14. Langley, who was 5 years younger than Homer, also graduated from Columbia, where he got 2 degrees, one in engineering and one in chemistry. But Langley wasn't just an accomplished scientist, he was also this incredible musician. In fact, he was such a talented pianist that he actually performed shows at New York's legendary Carnegie Hall. But despite their incredible achievements and their huge wealth, Homer and Langley never got married. And over time, after the death of their parents, Homer and Langley became more and more reclusive inside of this mansion. And then in 1933, so 14 years before this lone police officer had arrived at the Collier brothers' mansion to investigate a dead body, Homer Collier had had a stroke and went completely blind. He was only 55 at the time, and really he was at the height of his career, but he was forced to quit his law practice. As for Langley, even though he was very successfully selling pianos and playing these incredible shows at Carnegie Hall, he too had to give up what he was doing and stay home and take care of his brother. And once this happened, the two brothers basically stayed in the mansion all the time. They basically never left. And they also stopped paying any of their bills, so their water, their phone, their electricity all got cut off. But instead of the brothers paying the bills to get the power back, Langley just went out and bought a Model T car, and he pulled the engine out of the car and built his own generator. And then when they stopped paying their mortgage, eventually the police came to the mansion to evict them. And when Langley came to the door to speak to the officer, he just wrote a check for the entire amount of the mansion, basically paying for it on the spot. He handed the check to the police officer and then told the officer to leave them alone. And so fast forward back to March 21st, 1947, and this lone police officer, after staring up at this dilapidated mansion, finally walked forward and climbed over all the furniture and junk that was all out front, and he literally climbed his way up the front steps to the front door, where he began pounding on it. But after a while, no one came to the door, and the officer couldn't hear anything inside. Now, because this officer was here to investigate a dead body, no matter how uncredible the claim, the officer knew he really needed to get inside and have a look around. And so he decided he would try to break in the front door. And so after knocking a few more times, just to make sure really no one was there, the officer called out and said, "I'm coming in," and then began pounding with his shoulder against the door. And pretty quickly, the door gave way. But it only opened a few inches. And so the officer tried to fit through it, but he was too big, he couldn't fit. But he was able to look into the crack, and he saw there was this huge man-made wall that was basically positioned right inside of the mansion, blocking the front door from opening more than a couple of inches. And so as the officer was thinking about why there would be this wall here, he began to smell this terrible smell coming out of the mansion. And at that point, the officer thought, okay, there could be a dead body in here. I don't know what's going on. And so he called for backup. When backup arrived, the group of officers attempted to smash the front door in together. All 7 of them are ramming against this door, but they could not break down the man-made wall inside. And so ultimately, the police got a ladder and they lined it up on the side of the property, and one of the officers was able to climb up to the 2nd floor, break a window, and climb in that way. And once the police all made their way into the 2nd floor of this mansion, they realized very quickly that the tip Charles Smith had given had been correct. correct. There was a dead body inside of this mansion. It was Homer Collier, the older brother. He was seated in a chair in this alcove on the second floor. He only had on this ragged bathrobe, and he was kind of slouched forward with his head resting on his knee with all these orange peels all around him. The coroner would ultimately determine that Homer likely had been dead for about 10 hours. As for Langley Collier, despite looking around the mansion for him, they couldn't find him. It was like he had just vanished into thin air. And so pretty quickly, the police became suspicious of Langley because they couldn't find him, and they began to think, maybe he had something to do with his brother's death, and that's why he's not here now. In fact, maybe it was Langley who called in the tip as Charles Smith out on the road somewhere after he'd run away. So the police posted an officer at the Collier brothers' mansion. Basically, his job was to stay there in case Langley came back at any time. He could be detained. And then also the police put out a 9-state alarm. Basically, all the states around New York were told to keep an eye out for Langley because he was wanted for questioning in connection to his brother's death. And so as police agencies all across the East Coast searched for Langley, largely in vain, detectives in New York continued to search the Collier brothers' mansion to find clues that might shed some light about where Langley went and what role he might have played in Homer's death. And on April 8th, 1947, so 18 days after Homer was first discovered, the police would finally find that big clue that would break the case wide open. Back on March 21st, when that lone police officer first responded to the Collier brothers' house because of this call about the dead body, and then the officer broke the door in and discovered that man-made wall right behind the door, well, that man-made wall was not constructed out of normal building materials like brick or wood or anything else you might expect a wall to be built out of. Instead, it was built out of things like chairs and beds and a sewing machine and all sorts of just junk. It was trash. And this trash wall started right in front of the inside of the front door, and it extended back towards the interior living space of that floor. Except there really wasn't any living space at all anywhere inside of this mansion. Not the second floor, first, third, fourth, nowhere. Because every surface inside of this mansion was covered wall to wall, floor to ceiling in trash. Things like 14 broken pianos, an x-ray machine, there was a horse's jawbone, there were 25,000 books, and of course they had all of their father's glass jars that contained all of these human body parts. And over the years, the Collier brothers had apparently begun to think that their neighbors and random passerbys out on the street would someday break into their mansion and steal these treasures from their home. For reference, the Collier brothers did have real treasure in their house. They had tons of cash, they had jewelry, they had real valuables. But to them, that wasn't the real treasure. The real treasure were the things they pulled out of the dumpsters all around the city. And so that was the stuff they were worried about getting stolen from random people outside. And so they had begun fortifying the inside of this mansion to protect themselves when inevitably these people began breaking in. And so basically the inside of their mansion had not just been turned into a big trash pile, but instead they had created all these sophisticated tunnels through all the trash that was everywhere, and lining these tunnels and all these special alleyways they had built were real booby traps. And it was when the police were inspecting one of these tunnels with booby traps in it that they discovered the big clue that broke the case wide open. Based on that big clue, here is the leading theory about what happened to Homer and Langley Collier. Back on March 9th, 1947, so the night that Langley had snuck out the front door in the middle of the night with his shabby clothes on and headed to Brooklyn where he went dumpster diving, well, he wasn't just dumpster diving to find new treasures to bring back to the mansion to stuff inside. Instead, he was actually looking for something really specific for his brother. He was looking for oranges, like the fruit. And this particular dumpster in Brooklyn was right behind a store that sold fruit, and so there were always lots of oranges in this dumpster. Langley was actually trying his very best to take care of his older brother Homer. He had actually begun doing research using his father's old medical textbooks to try to find a cure for Homer's blindness caused by his stroke. And at some point, Langley believed he really had come across the cure. And the cure was basically for Homer to eat oranges. lots and lots of oranges. And in fact, over the last several weeks before this night, Langley had already made this change in Homer's diet. He only fed him oranges for every single meal. He got them from this dumpster and he fed them to Homer. And Homer, he too believed this cure was going to work, and so he ate the oranges without question. And so back on March 9th, after Langley had gathered up the oranges from inside this dumpster, slung it on his shoulder, and walked back to his mansion, he maneuvered his way through the crack in the front door because he was super skinny. He was able to barely get through. And then once he was inside the mansion and shut the door behind him, he maneuvered his way up to the second floor. And then he began the most dangerous part of his journey from one side of the second floor to the other where Homer was. Basically, Langley needed to crawl through a 2-foot wide tunnel he had built through all the junk and trash, but it was lined with booby traps. In particular, there was a nasty trap at the end of the tunnel where there was this stack of metal boxes filled with all these newspapers. They were really heavy, and they were positioned so if you even so much as barely touched the lowest box, they would come crashing down on you. Now, Langley had made this journey countless times. This is how he went to see his brother every single day, as he went through this tunnel. But on this day, as he low-crawled his way through the tight tunnel in the trash, he accidentally knocked the lowest metal box. The boxes tumbled down on him and pinned him to the ground. Now, these boxes were very heavy, but they were not heavy enough to kill someone. It would just pin them down. It would be impossible to get out from under them. And so Langley, very likely, after getting trapped, called out for his brother, Homer, who was actually only 10 feet away from him. But Homer was blind, he was sick, he had absolutely no energy because all he ate was oranges and it was basically killing him. And so he couldn't even get out of his chair, let alone go save his brother. And so for several agonizing hours, Langley likely yelled for his brother until the weight of all these boxes did crush him to death. And then Homer was left all alone in this house where no one knew he needed help and no one could even get to him if they wanted to. And so he was doomed. And so for 2 weeks, Homer just sat in this chair, starving to death, while he likely listened to the sound of rats eating his brother's body. The big clue that the police found that broke this case wide open is they actually spotted Langley's white foot bone that had been picked clean by the rats jutting up out of this trash tunnel 10 feet away from Homer. When the police had first searched the mansion, it was so full of stuff that they never saw this bone. It just kind of blended in. But 18 days after finding Homer, they realized Langley was right there. There was a skeleton. As for the Charles Smith tipster that police thought had to be Langley calling in after he had murdered his brother, well, it wasn't Langley because Langley was dead at the time this tip came in. And so Charles Smith was a real person who very likely just walked past the mansion and he probably caught a whiff of the smell of rotting dead bodies, and so he called it in. 4 months after Homer and Langley were found dead inside of their maze of trash, their mansion was declared a fire hazard and demolished. Today, there is a small park called the Collier Brothers Park, and it's filled with nothing but a couple of trees and a bench. So that's going to do it. If you enjoyed today's story, be sure to check out our podcast called the MrBallen Podcast, where we have hundreds more stories just like this one, but many of them are only on the podcast. So again, it's called the MrBallen Podcast, and it's available exclusively on Amazon Music.